All right. Thank you, Russ. Again, here to talk about the waste emissions charge. For intros, it'd be great if everyone could just go around and say their name, and we'll get started.
I'm Vanessa Lynch, a PA field organizer with Moms Clean Air Force.
I'm Alice Liu, policy coordinator at Clean Air Council.
Andrew Klooster. I am the Colorado field advocate with Earthworks. You're probably all familiar with my colleague, or maybe familiar with my colleague, Melissa Ostroff. But I was tagged in for the webinar today because she thought that I had more horrifying visuals to share with you all. So that is why I'm joining you all from Denver, Colorado.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, we all big fans of Melissa in this group. And I'm Russ Zerbo. I'm an advocate with the Clean Air Council.
David Gibson, staff coordinator of Peace, Justice, Sustainability Now. We're a statewide associate group of Peace Action, and I was the original canvas director at Clean Air Council.
Oh, yeah. Welcome, David.
Oh. Thanks, David. I'll pass it on now to Vanessa, but everyone, please feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat.
All right. So my portion of today's conversation about the methane waste emission charges is the frontline perspective. I clearly am, as I said, a Pennsylvania field organizer with Moms Clean Air Force. We're a community of over 1.5 million moms and dads united against air pollution and the urgent crisis of our changing climate to equitably protect children's health. And the core of that is really just tying community conversations around air pollution and climate change to really look at how we impact children's health and to do it in a way that's equitable for all. So my story starts in my local community. This is a well pad that was fracked in our community just above a park that my children spent many a day in their childhood playing baseball and soccer at. And you can see the impacts for our community. In the center, you can see a picture of the clear cutting where all the pipelines went to move the gas through, and all the trees that were lost in that process. You can see a line of the trucks that were used to bring in water in order to do the fracking that occurred, and also a water pipeline in the bottom right-hand corner, another sort of impact for our local community, pulling water out of our local streams and rivers, and really just the impacts that happen in communities across Pennsylvania when fracking occurs. So the main component in natural gas is methane. And so that's why we're talking about this methane waste emissions charge. And methane is a greenhouse gas that's responsible for 25% of current climate change. And it's over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So for those of us who are old enough to remember carbon dioxide being the conversation we had about greenhouse gases and climate change, the reason methane is such an important part of the conversation now is that near-term impact. We really want to make huge progress on climate, and in order to do that, methane has got to be a central part of the conversation. Unfortunately, where methane appears, volatile organic compounds, which have serious health harming properties, are also present. VOCs can affect health and include things like benzene, and they contribute to ground level ozone or smog that can cause asthma attacks or other respiratory problems. And this is a map of my local community, where our well pad is, where the park is, and where our middle school and elementary school are located. You know, these kinds of proximities are absolutely the norm across Pennsylvania. And in communities like mine, we're doing everything we can to be as protective as possible. The waste emission charges are another important part of the conversation. So when you look more closely at health impacts, clearly benzene with its possibilities for leukemia, lung infections and things like that, formaldehyde, asthma attacks and cancer, the silica dust that comes from the sand that's used in the process of fracking, and ground level ozone. And what we see, especially in our most vulnerable populations like women and pregnant women and children, we see low birth weight, preterm birth, high risk pregnancies, cancers, neural tube defects, congenital heart defects. You know, there's a recent study that said that acute lymphoblastic leukemia rates were 2 to 3 times more likely for children who were born in areas near fracking well pads between the ages of 2 and 7. And, you know, after that research came out, a friend of mine called me and said, I'm fairly certain my son was one of the people counted in that study. Her son had been 2 years old and developed acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Her family dealt with that cancer, and they lived near a fracking well pad. And, you know, the saddest part of that story for families is dealing with such an impactful thing. And even harder to hear was the fact that 2 other children on her street were dealing with cancers at the same time. You know, another really big impact for frontline communities are around asthma rates. Asthma attacks have been found by a Pitt study to be 4 to 5 times greater within 10 miles of a well pad during production. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that there are serious health impacts for families and children near these areas. So what are the kinds of things that we look at to protect us? Well, EPA safeguards, state implementation plans, federal methane pollution reduction plans. This waste emission charge is another really important part of the puzzle of protecting local communities. This is a picture of Olivia at Summit Elementary School at playground in Butler County. Her school is 700 feet from a well pad, but this playground is much, much closer. You know, the measurements of distance between well pads and structures is the structure itself. And so children can be even closer in the where they live and learn and play. I just wanted to share a little video, just sort of really leaning into the idea of who we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about why these kinds of actions are so important.
Climate change directly impacts my future.
Our elected leaders have a responsibility to do their part to cut the air pollution causing climate change.
Oil and gas operations across the nation create methane pollution, a potent greenhouse gas that contributes to the climate crisis.
This is an enormous fossil fuel pollution problem.
I have a right to breathe clean air. I have the right to safely play outside.
I have a right to a bright future with a family of my own.
We must stop climate change in its tracks.
My generation will inherit the climate change problems that you create today.
For me.
For my family.
For my parents and grandparents. It's time to do the right thing.
Act on climate change and protect us from methane pollution now.
We are depending on you.
So the secondary half of the conversation, you know, for communities, when we talk about frontline impacts, is the secondary part of the conversation is clearly climate change impacts. So looking at climate change and the way that it impacts all of us, we're seeing more and more extreme weather and extreme temperatures have had some of the hottest years on record. I think last year was the hottest year on record. Worsening floods and droughts, devastating wildfires. The number of climate change impacts is very high. And what I think we sometimes don't pay enough attention to and need to think about are the mental health burden that each of these things has on communities. And it's really this layering of the conversation. So how does severe weather impact human health? Well, it causes more injuries and fatalities. How does air pollution, which is worsened by climate change, impact human health? Through asthma and cardiovascular disease. And so when we layer these things on top of each other and on top of communities that are already burdened by the impacts of being a frontline community with well pads, you start to see this really powerful story. So I took a look at and thought about climate change impacts in the area that I live in Pittsburgh. And Last summer, there were severe smoke and haze issues from Canadian wildfires, which were absolutely made worse by climate change, and had really bad air quality in our area, which is worst for children and the elderly and our most disadvantaged communities. But the reality is, even somebody like me who is a healthy middle-aged adult, by day 3 and 4 of this wildfire smoke, I was starting to have vocal impacts and my throat was starting to feel very uncomfortable. And then we look at things like flooding in the Pittsburgh area and our flood risk over the next 30 years, which is considered severe when it comes to critical infrastructure. When it comes to our roads, it's extreme risk. And then we layer on top of that Pennsylvania already being the area with the highest number of cases of Lyme disease in the nation, triple the number from just 10 years ago. This increase is possibly due to Western expansion of Lyme-bearing ticks and warmer winters that are leading to higher tick populations. This information is from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And I can tell you, I have many neighbors who have had Lyme disease, and a friend of mine who lives a couple of miles from here, her daughter actually had Lyme meningitis. Again, sort of having this conversation of overlaying on top of impacts that already exist from fracking. And then we bring in things like Pittsburgh's climate emissions not falling quickly enough to meet our climate goals. So then looking at things like the waste emission charge program, we really start to see why this is so important. The program itself will really allow us to move quickly, to act quickly, and to implement methane reductions quickly. And so that is my presentation for today.
Thanks, Vanessa. I will take on the next part, and if folks have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come back to those at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I will be covering the portion about the waste emissions charge, talking about what it does, and we'll be talking through some of the areas that we can strengthen the proposed rule. So as Vanessa has mentioned, methane is a prime target for climate change reductions and mitigation because it is such a potent greenhouse gas and because it doesn't last in the atmosphere for as long as other greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. This rule, at its most basic level, essentially sets and collects an annual charge for excessive methane emissions. This would be for some of the largest polluters, and they would have to exceed a certain emissions threshold that's determined by what kind of facility they are. The fee will also increase over time. So this fee is based on, it is for every metric ton of excessive methane that's emitted. And so that fee starts at $900 in 2024, which is when it's set to come into play. And for the years after that will increase. And there are 3 main important components that we'll be talking through. First is the waste emissions charge, or as I'll say, WEC threshold. That's something that will be based off of reported methane emissions from facilities. And that will kind of be, that will be compared to a facility-specific limit that will be calculated. Facilities can also net emissions if they are owned by a common entity. And facilities can also seek certain emissions exemptions based on environmental permitting delays, regulatory compliance, or well plugging. And we'll be talking about those as well. But before we dive into those, I wanted to briefly cover what kind of facilities or industry segments, as the EPA will refer to them as, what kinds of these segments will be impacted by the WEC. And so here in red, you'll see this is an EPA graphic. The red facilities are the kinds of facilities that are currently subject to the Subpart W greenhouse gas reporting program. So if any of these facilities are emitting high enough amount of greenhouse gases every year, they'll be required to report to this program. You'll notice that some of these over here, at least, this red facility here is a distribution pipeline. This is not included in the waste emissions charge. However, all of these other red subpart W facilities are included. And you'll see a list here on the side of the different components that may be impacted by the waste emissions charge. And this makes up a pretty large amount of the different types of segments that are present in oil and gas infrastructure. Now turning to netting provisions are required by statute. So the EPA is required to include some form of netting provision in this rule. What the EPA is proposing to do here is to allow for facilities that have a common owner to kind of net or offset their emissions across facilities. So first, a facility has to be WEC eligible, meaning that it produces enough greenhouse gas emissions to require it to report its emissions. How this netting process might play out would be, if an operator or an owner had multiple facilities, one facility did not exceed thresholds, but another facility did, it could take those kind of negative emissions and use it to offset some of those higher emitting facilities. And it would use that overall value of emissions as the ultimate WEC eligible emissions that could be charged. However, any facilities that are receiving an exemption, which we'll be talking about next, cannot be included in this netting process. So the first type of exemption is the environmental permitting delay exemption. This would allow for any emissions that are caused by a delay in permitting for infrastructure that is either gathering or transmission infrastructure required for gas offtake to not be included in total WEC amount calculations. So in order for this exemption to be applied, the EPA is suggesting 4 criteria be met. So first, emissions would need to exceed a threshold. Second, the entity that is seeking the exemption, so the facility that is, that has this gas that needs to be taken off its infrastructure, and the entity that is required or that is responsible for permitting this gathering or transmission infrastructure, these 2 parties cannot be responsible for causing this delay. Third, only emissions that are caused by and affected by this delay that are subsequently flared can be included in this exemption. So this does not exempt the entire facility. And the EPA is suggesting that 30 to 42 months must have passed since this filing of a permit in order for it to be a delay. Next, we have the regulatory compliance exemption. This is specific to the methane rule. If you were with us for our previous webinar, we talked about the methane rule. It was finalized back in December, and states are currently in the process of getting ready for and working on their state implementation plans, and that's what SIP stands for. So in order for this exemption to be available, first, all states must have a state implementation plan that has been approved by the EPA, and all plans must be effective for emissions reductions. And there's a way that the EPA is planning on determining that. It's important to note that this process is at least going to take 2 years. And so this exemption probably won't come into play for the next few years. But if either of these two criteria are no longer met, so if a state implementation plan is no longer effective, this exemption goes away for all facilities in all states. And at the facility level, if any facility no longer is in compliance, then this exemption would be removed for that entire facility. Of course, again, this is specific to the methane rule, and the methane rule does not apply to all of the facilities we talked about earlier. And so here you'll recognize this is the image I showed you earlier. It includes all these facilities that are impacted by subpart W and are eligible for the WEC. And here you'll see just the facilities that are impacted by the methane rule. The final exemption is the plugged well exemption. This would basically exempt emissions from wells that have been plugged or are permanently shut in, and it would apply the year after that plugging or shutting in has been done. And the EPA is requiring that all well plugging meet state and federal requirements. So as we mentioned, the public comment period is coming up, or the deadline is coming up. It's closing next Tuesday on March 26th. And Clean Air Council has put together some recommendations for what we think can be strengthened in this rule. Feel free to scan the QR code. There's also this tiny URL underneath it, and Russ has put in that link in the chat. That'll all lead to the same place. But what we're asking for are essentially these 5 things. First, limiting the scope of what constitutes a common owner in the netting provisions. We think that, this netting can potentially be harmful for communities that are frontline communities, communities with heavily polluting oil and gas infrastructure right in their backyards, because if a company is allowed to use another facility to offset emissions from a high polluting facility in another area, this might not hold polluters accountable. And so limiting the scope of common owner to only owner and operator and not by parent company would be a good first step. And then exploring how maybe geography such as state can also be used to limit that scope. Second, we would ask EPA to maintain this regulatory exemption availability only once all states have this state implementation plan in place, and once the facilities that are seeking exemption are in compliance with them. Third, we would ask that WEC responsible parties for any facility that has multiple owners to be by default the chief operator. The EPA should be requiring this by default and not allowing these multiple owners to kind of determine who is responsible for paying the waste emissions charge. In terms of the permitting delays, we believe that EPA should be considering this on a case-by-case basis. So operators and those seeking this exemption should be required to prove and demonstrate that a gathering pipeline, for example, is absolutely necessary in this case to take this gas off of the facility. Litigation delays should not be considered a permitting delay. And even if a permitting delay is allowed, operators should be required to demonstrate that other options beyond just flaring have been considered. And then finally, for the well plugging exemption, EPA should ensure that wells are demonstrated to be effectively plugged and not polluting for the near future. So this wraps up my portion. I'll be passing it on to Andrew, and please direct any questions to me in the chat.
One second while I share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that, correct? Cool. So as I said, I am Andrew Klooster, and I technically don't live or work in Pennsylvania, but I do work at Earthworks with Melissa, and Melissa and I are both certified optical gas imaging thermographers at Earthworks. And so if you're not familiar with our work, which it sounds like quite a few of you are and know Melissa, we're some of the Earthworks staff who have gone through the training to be able to operate our fancy optical gas imaging cameras. And what these cameras allow us to do is they are specially designed infrared cameras that allow us to visualize airborne pollutants from oil and gas equipment that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye. We do make them naked, we expose them. So these pollutants are the pollutants that Vanessa talked about. These are methane, which, as we know, is a potent greenhouse gas, and also other volatile organic compounds, which have direct health impacts on people who are nearby to this infrastructure. And so our camera at Earthworks, we use these cameras to as an accountability tool, as kind of a public awareness and education tool. But these are also the same cameras that the industry themselves use to conduct leak detection and repair, to look at their equipment, find leaks, and fix it. And this, before I go forward on the rest of my slides, and just as a reminder, my part of the presentation today, I think, is to really scare you all, spur you into giving comment and taking action by showing you some of these large emission events from large facilities in Colorado that we're hopeful will be the sorts of things that we can bring a little bit more accountability over, in terms of the WEC kind of applying as an accountability mechanism that we at Earthworks might be able to apply to hold operators accountable for these large emission events that potentially represent exceedances of their thresholds. But before I go forward, I always, on my first slides of any presentation, include an image like this that kind of just gives a primer, if you've never encountered our work before, of how our camera works. This juxtaposed image, the left-hand side is just a photo of a storage tank. The right-hand side is a photo using our optical gas imaging camera, same storage tank, same well pad in Colorado. What you can't see, what you couldn't see if you were just looking at this facility, is this plume of methane and VOCs that's venting out of the vent stack of this tank. But that's what our camera allows us to see. So I do have a few slides that are kind of text heavy, and I'm going to move through them relatively quickly because some of this has already been covered by Alice and by Vanessa. But I do think it's really important to understand one of the things that underpins the WEC and also potentially gives us this new potential accountability kind of mechanism is the fact that the changes that are also being proposed to the greenhouse gas reporting program are going to require more actual measurement and quantification of emissions than what currently exists. And so at the moment, and this hopefully is maybe not news to all of you, maybe it is, but at the moment, the majority of our understanding of the emissions from oil and gas, methane, but also VOC emissions, is based on estimations. It's based on operator-reported estimations. They run, so if you're an operator applying for an air permit for a flare in Pennsylvania, you're going to put a bunch of numbers into a formula. It's going to spit out a calculated annual average of what the emissions from that piece of equipment is going to be. And that's then what gets reported to the state, what gets reported to the EPA. And all of our emissions inventories are, for the most part, made up of data like this that isn't necessarily ground tested or ground truth in terms of actual measurement data. So the changes to the greenhouse gas reporting program are going to require more site-specific measurement than what currently occurs. And that then actual measurement data is going to inform the development of some of these facility-wide thresholds and our understanding of inventories. And this quantification is really important because in order to really, I think, effectively apply the waste emission charge, especially for those of us who are kind of in this third-party watchdog role, if we can quantify an event and then compare it to the threshold for that facility, we can potentially make the argument that a single event potentially exceeded their emissions limit for that facility. All those other factors that Alice kind of talked about considered. But in general, too, the goal with the WEC and with this kind of greater scrutiny that this will allow us over the emissions that are coming from this facility is that greater scrutiny alone is going to potentially prompt some operators to make some changes, adjust their behavior before any potential charges kick in. And I also have this slide here to just kind of go over really quickly some important considerations when we're talking about quantification, when we're talking about the application, this layering of this new sort of accountability mechanism. One thing, and this first bullet is maybe a little tangential, but I'm including it because it's something that I encounter a lot in Colorado. And I think it's important for you all to just consider as we're thinking about measurement and quantification of oil and gas emissions, is that monitoring and measurement are different things. And you may have heard of operators in your local area that are, for instance, employing fence line air quality monitors around the perimeter of a large oil and gas pad. And that operator may or may not be claiming that those monitors are allowing them to have an understanding of the emissions that are coming off of the equipment on that pad. And that's just unfortunately not the case. Monitoring is not really designed to measure or quantify emissions. It's designed to identify plumes of emissions, similar to the work that our OGI camera does. And so I do think when we're kind of parsing through this, or as you're crafting comments, as you're thinking about measurement, don't conflate those two. They're very different. That doesn't mean that monitoring can't be part of a measurement scheme. It just means that it can't be the sole sort of approach that we take to measuring oil and gas emissions, because monitors themselves are not sophisticated enough oftentimes to do quantification. And so that kind of leads to my second point on this slide, which is also important for us to consider, is as we start to have more measurement informing our inventories, more actual quantification, it's important to realize that this is going to require a lot of different technologies at different scales. So we have the satellites that are starting to come online that are going to allow us to quantify emissions. We have flyovers that are starting to be done of certain areas that allow us to quantify emissions. And then there's the really useful application for ground level technology too. And comparing all of this and contrasting it allows us to sort of quantify different emission plumes at different scales. And that's really important for building a robust kind of inventory based on actual data, actual measurement, and actual quantification. And that sort of just follows to the last point, which is that, really for these updates to the greenhouse gas reporting program to work well in terms of this kind of new measurement data being used to inform these thresholds, we need to ensure, because ultimately all of this measurement is going to be done by operators, and they're still going to be the ones reporting to the EPA in regards to reporting their emissions. They're going to be reporting any potential exceedances for the most part, unless, again, we can kind of as a third party catch something. And so we need to ensure that there's strong audits in place and that there's strong regulatory oversight, and that this data can be trusted, because we're kind of embarking on this new frontier where we actually are potentially going to have more data informing our understanding of emissions. We need to ensure that data that operators are generating is trustworthy, so that we can actually hold them accountable when actual exceedances occur. And one more quick slide before I share some videos with you all. And there's a lot of text on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of it in the interest of time, but I will make this slide deck available to you all afterwards. I don't mind if you have it for review and reference. But I do just want to point out one of the important things, because I'm going to show you a couple now videos of what I would consider significant emission events that we've captured on large facilities in Colorado using our camera. So I always think it's important to be upfront about the limitations that our camera technology has. So optical gas imaging cameras are really, really powerful tools, and Earthworks has been able to use them very successfully, but they don't allow us to quantify emissions when we're looking at a plume. So this image on this slide, for instance, is another tank that's venting. I can't look at that and tell you the volume that is coming off of that tank. I can't tell you how much methane is being put into the atmosphere just by looking at this image. Our camera doesn't allow us to do that. It doesn't allow us either to speciate, so we can't differentiate between methane and benzene, for instance, in a plume. And that's just important because the videos I'm going to share with you are significant because of certain factors, but that doesn't mean that they're not emission events that were quantified in any way. These are the sorts of emission events that I would hope in the future with satellites and other things we could quantify, and then again, compare to the threshold for these facilities and potentially hold an operator accountable for an exceedance based on these emission events. So I'm going to share 4 different videos from 3 separate large facilities in Colorado. This first one is a compressor station that's right outside of Denver. And then the next 2 slides will be videos from 2 large multi-well pads that were recently fracked in Colorado when I filmed the emission events from them. And all 4 of these observations that I'm going to show you have 2 things in common that are allowing me to make the determination that these are significant emission events, the sort of which we would hope to be able to quantify and then potentially compare to these new thresholds and potentially get this operator charged for exceeding their emissions thresholds. And the 2 factors are, one is when we're using our cameras, one of the shorthands we do have for the size or the severity of an event is how far away were we from the facility filming it when we could see these emissions, because it's not completely as it's a shorthand, it's a proxy for the size of an event. Again, we can't quantify, but I'm not going to be able to detect a small component leak from, let's say, a separator from a quarter of a mile away. That's just not something I'll be able to visualize. So if I am able to visualize a large plume from a quarter of a mile away, it's typically a much more significant amount of emissions that are escaping from whatever piece of equipment it is that we're filming. And so in all of the videos I'm going to show you, the distance from which I was filming these events was over a quarter of a mile away. And the other important thing to understand about what I'm going to show you, and this is just a little bit of insight too into what our camera is displaying, these are infrared cameras. So when you're looking at this black and white image, the colors in this black and white image are actually also a sort of clue to the relative temperature of objects in that image. So the camera uses the color palette to represent a sort of rough temperature gradient. And so anything that is white or lighter is going to be warmer or hotter than something that's dark. And so what we see in both of these visuals on the slide is this compressor station that looks like it's in the miniature because I'm really far away from it when I filmed it. And we see 3 compressors. Those white, hot components that are in the foreground are compressors themselves. So this is the equipment that actually compresses the gas and moves it through the pipeline. And they're white like that because they're very, very hot. They were running actively. We don't care about the compressors in either of these videos. What we care about is what looks like black smoke that is on the left-hand video. It's a slide on the video on the left-hand of the slide. That black smoke, what looks like black smoke, is moving to the right, and then the camera pans, and you can see we're tracking it across the horizon. On the right-hand visual, that black smoke, what looks like black smoke, is moving to the left. That is methane and VOCs, and it is appearing black like this in the camera because it is completely unheated. And why the reason it's unheated is because it's being directly vented from a tank that's situated behind those compressors. And so when we're looking at emissions from an event like this, and they're appearing to be unheated, that is a good indication that venting is occurring, or the emissions are escaping from a component piece of equipment without any sort of control being applied. And when I say that, what I mean is, they're not being routed through a combustor or flare, and some of that methane and VOCs, aren't potentially being destroyed. This is just methane and VOCs dumping directly into the atmosphere from some event. So those 2 factors are important for these observations and for the subsequent 2 that I'll quickly share. The other important thing about this one is this was an event, as you can see from the text on both of these little animated GIFs, that we I filmed in May of 2022, and then I filmed again in November of 2022. So same facility, same piece of equipment, relatively large emission event that we could film from a great distance. These were emissions that weren't being controlled anyway. They were just being directly dumped into the atmosphere. And there was no real, when the operator investigated in both of these instances, they couldn't find any sort of compliance issue present that would have indicated that there was something going on. They never really got to the bottom of either of these emission events that I recorded and shared with the state. So this is the sort of thing, especially since they both occurred in the same calendar year, that if we had been able to quantify these emission events and we had been able to compare it to the threshold that was established for this compressor station, we might have been able to make an argument that these emission events in both of them, or even a single one of them, potentially led to an exceedance of their threshold. This is the sort of new level of accountability that we're hoping the WEC will be able to provide. So moving along, this is, again, that first observations were of a compressor station. The next 2 that I have to share are emission events from just large multi-well pads. I believe this is a pad with 12, 13 wells on it. Just recently fracked when I recorded this video, and I don't have the text on this for some reason, but there is a timestamp there. This was also in 2022 that I recorded this. And what we see here is another large uncontrolled amount of emissions coming off of, that's a row of storage tanks, so crude oil storage tanks. Once again, I'm well over a quarter of a mile away from this facility. You can see the irrigation equipment, the agricultural field between me and the pad. And once again, when we shared this video with the state of this huge plume coming off of these tanks and the operator investigated, they couldn't really identify any compliance issue. They said there might have been a hatch left open on one of the tanks. They were doing some unloading that day. There was a truck that came to unload some of the liquids from the tanks into that tanker truck, and maybe a hatch was left open. The result was this massive emission event that I could film from, again, over a quarter of a mile away. And it doesn't appear in this GIF, but in the actual whole video that we have on YouTube, I pan and pan and pan across the horizon, and this plume is going directly into a residential neighborhood. Once again, this plume was not in any way quantified, so we don't know the total amount of methane that this represented or the total amount of VOCs. But with more of this technology coming online with this ability to quantify, again, this is another example where no fine or violation was issued for this video, but with the ability to pair that with some of this quantification, we might have been able to make an argument that this was an exceedance and they should be held accountable for it. And then finally, one last video, and I've kind of ordered these in terms of qualitatively how horrific I find these emissions. So this is one of the most horrific things I have filmed in Colorado to date, and this was from late last year. And what we're looking at here is another large multi-well pad that I was filming from, again, quite a distance away. We have another giant release of uncontrolled emissions. And in this case, that rig that's on that pad is not a drilling rig, that's a workover rig. So they had just finished completions, just finished fracking on this pad, and they were coming in to do some maintenance, and they were depressurizing one of the wells in order to actually safely access that well. And so they were just releasing all of the gas from that well directly into the atmosphere. And what results is this geyser of methane and VOCs that is, just for context, those workover rigs tend to be 60, 70 feet tall. This plume was far, far exceeding that height in terms of it just ejecting into the atmosphere. And in this case, so there was a maintenance event that was occurring, or they were prepping for a maintenance event, and so they were depressurizing this well. But there was this giant question mark when I shared this video with the state, because they could have attempted to control these emissions in some way. They could have routed them through the flares that are, so those pieces of equipment that are just to the left of the plume aren't grain silos, those are flares. But for whatever reason, they decided not to use those flares to control this emission event. They just dumped it directly into the atmosphere. Once again, there was no real sort of fine or violation or anything issued for this. The operator kind of just shrugged it off. Very, very significant emission event, and the sort of thing that, again, with some quantification under our tool belt, with the ability to kind of demonstrate, okay, we have, a satellite captured this event, and we think it was this much methane, and this is the threshold for that facility, another potential new case that we could make to add another layer of accountability to these sorts of massive emission events that occur. So that's all I have to share. And I am handing it off to Russ now to finish out, and I hopefully will be able to stick around to the end for any questions. But again, I'll also share the slide deck in the chat, and you all will have my email as well if you have any questions you want to email me afterwards. Or you can probably just ask Melissa too. She knows most of this as well.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really fantastic and a perfect transition into my aspect of the presentation, trying to bring this all home. You said this several times, we have a long way to go to truly quantifying the emissions from a lot of oil and gas infrastructure. And that is the entire intention of the waste emissions charge. We're billing the oil and gas industry for their emissions so we can further study and reduce them. That is the top line of this whole situation. And, it's going to feed directly in to the methane emissions reduction program, which was passed within the Inflation Reduction Act. And unfortunately, there are some people in Congress right now trying to repeal that. And even that gets a little bit complicated. There was HR 1141, the Natural Gas Tax Repeal Act. I would not call this a natural gas tax. It's a fee for emissions, which is very common in air quality regulation. And now that HR 1141 has been absorbed into HR 1023, which is even more complicated. So this is a nice explanation from the White House that I'll drop in the chat. And it's complicated. If you go to Google HR 1023, it may not even have the most recent version of it, which proposes to repeal the methane emissions reduction program. So this statement from the White House does a good job of going into that. So again, that's exactly why we need this. That's why you really should be communicating with your congresspeople and your senators about how not only do you want to defend the methane emissions reduction program, but you want to strengthen it. And thankfully, there are some senators, just so it's not all, bad news from our federal legislature. There are some new federal bills that would expand funding for methane research. So please look into that. These were very recently proposed, and it's always good when you're communicating with your legislators, not just to be opposing bad bills, but to be highlighting the good bills that we want out there. So there's added funds out there for methane research. And just to talk a little bit about how this actually functions, what the waste emissions charge establishes a threshold. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment because I thought that this was an interesting, this is just straight from the 257-page waste emission threshold or waste emission charge rule. And that the EPA is proposing to establish these different leakage rates that they're deeming acceptable for different types of technology. That is, how complicated this proposal is. Different types of infrastructure have different rates. We're saying that, it's understandable for onshore boosting stations to have a 0.05% leakage rate. And that's how this charge is being calculated. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But if a certain facility is going above that threshold, that percentage of its gas throughput, which I'll talk about in a moment, then, they're being charged this fee. And even that is an inexact science. And Andrew highlighted, this is not done with direct monitoring. The vast majority of the calculations of these emissions is done with modeling and estimations of the different what different aspects of the oil and gas industry their methane pollution. So if you have 100 pneumatic devices on your site and each one you have modeled to emit 0.01 tons of methane, we're going to add all those up and see if it surpasses that threshold. So again, that's how complicated, putting all these figures together is. And that's how much we truly need this funding to more accurately quantify these emissions. And even, when the methane rule is in effect years from now, technology will further evolve and we may be discovering new things about how potentially pollution reducing technologies are working. So this is not going to end once the methane rule is enforced. This technology is going to be constantly evolving. So we are really going to need these funds. And it's not just air monitoring that the funds from the charge and the methane emissions reduction program could be used for. This funding could go directly to frontline communities, even to update local ventilation systems in public facilities, which is something that we were really pushing for in the EPA's proposal for how the methane emissions reduction program, how those funds could be used. But I wanted to talk about a really interesting part of this and how they're calculating these numbers based on throughput, this sort of interesting word. And it's 0.02% of your gas throughput is what we're deeming a acceptable waste of emissions. And it's interesting because the methane rule in and of itself is entirely based on the concept that the amount of oil or gas that you're extracting from the ground does not really dictate your air pollution emissions. So that's a big finding that EPA has made in the last 5 or 10 years, and that's why all these new rules are happening. And they're still saying that now, the amount of gas that's going through these facilities, specifically to sale, that's a really interesting part of this rule in that, the throughput of gas that is going to sale, that's how the charge is calculated. And it's interesting because there are a few facilities that do not send their gas to sale, which is why I mentioned the underground methane storage and other types of methane storage. One of the parts of this rule that we really need to keep strong and that is not in Clean Air Council's suggested comment that I shared is that certain devices that are, or certain facilities that do not send their gas to sale, but send gas to be stored, the assumed waste emissions is 0. So any methane emissions above that would be calculated in the charge, and we really need to maintain that in this rule. The EPA has proposed to say that, you know, the waste emissions threshold is 0 for these facilities that are sending their gas into storage. But EPA has also floated that they could do the reverse, and they could say that any emissions from these facilities will not be counted. So we really want to make sure that they do not do that, and that they maintain that 0 waste emission threshold for devices that are sending gas to storage rather than to sale. And there are also emissions threshold for facilities that deal with oil as opposed to gas. EPA has proposed sort of equivalency measures. If you're dealing with this many barrels of oil, the assumption that you're going to have this many tons of methane. And that, I believe, I've mentioned the good and the bad bills. And it's also important that one of the really interesting aspects of this charge, and Alice mentioned earlier, it's going to affect facilities that are outside of the methane rule, which is really important. And, it's going to be years until the methane rule is fully enforced. So this charge is going to provide a current incentive. It's odd that the methane rule has been finalized, but will take years to be enforced. This rule has not been finalized yet, which is why we're currently in the comment period. But when it does get finalized, it will be in effect long before the methane rule is. So until those state implementation plans are approved, this waste emissions charge is going to be our best path to both reducing emissions from the oil and gas industry and, increasing funding for methane emissions reductions. Like, that is really, if you take nothing else from this presentation, we need this funding to study and reduce methane emissions. And particularly, the main thing we need to fund, in addition to, technology upgrades at this facility, is the super emitter program that is within the EPA methane rule. They're allowing for third-party air monitoring, but they're not allocating any funding for that. So how do we get that funding for third-party air monitoring that is really going to protect the frontline communities that Vanessa was talking about? Is we need the funding from the methane emissions reduction program, which comes from the funds generated from the waste emissions charge. If you can connect the dots on all those different EPA rules and included legislation. So I think it is 2:58. It's probably a good place to start, or stop rather. And if people have questions, feel free to air them, and we'll obviously be available after this webinar. Yes, I agree. Those were the super fund for emissions. That is interesting. And it's funny that we need a super fund for super fund because they don't really fund that program as much as we would like to anymore.
I mean, it seems like the same kind of concept, it's like we can't just get the money to, take care of this. So we have to get it from them to take care of this.
Exactly. And that's a really good example, when you're communicating with your legislators. Superfund's been in existence since late 70s, I believe. These are not new ideas. This is how we try to protect public health in this country. So that's a great point.
And Russ, important too is the act now, right? I mean, the important part of WEC is it really helps us act more quickly.
Absolutely. As soon as WEC is finalized, which will probably be within this year at some point, or rather, I believe the charge begins in 2024. Yes, exactly. So I'm pretty sure as soon, very shortly after this being finalized, that charge will go into effect.
And I think it's also important to sort of highlight or emphasize if you're in your comments or talk. I mean, this isn't unreasonable either, in the sense that they're being charged for exceedances of what they're being allowed to emit. You know, this isn't necessarily punitive, because they're already, it's a demonstration that they're exceeding their allowable limits in the first place, and that's what they're being charged for. And so it's not some, you know, stretch of the imagination. We're not trying to do anything all that radical here with this like charge. But again, you know, the goal too with that would be that, again, you know, an operator who actually doesn't want to get charged is going to be plugging wells to get them exempt, or doing other things to ensure that they're not going to be hit with this charge. So that's where the kind of expedited sort of process on emissions reductions we're hoping will kind of kick in, is from their behavior changing to avoid this charge.
And that's an excellent question from Justin in the chat. And I'm happy to say that one of the things that the charge going to the methane emissions reduction program will actually include third-party air monitoring. So, you know, most of this is based on industry self-reporting, as Andrew pointed out. But we are beginning to fund third-party air monitoring. We are, you know, taking steps, very necessary steps, in my opinion, away from industry self-reporting. So that's a great way, again, to communicate with your legislators about this. Like, hey, like we've been relying on industry self-reporting for so long, and it hasn't been going well. So we need this funding to bring in some other partners. That's a great question.
Yeah, and as I said, I mentioned briefly in my presentation too, I mean, this is what we're hopeful at Earthworks. You know, as some of these methane satellites and flyover data are made available to the public, that we also will have access to some of this to sort of compare and contrast with what these thresholds are. I mean, if we filmed some like that last event that I showed you all, a satellite also picked it up and quantified it, and then we could compare that to what the threshold was for that, you know, in that facility. You know, there's some accountability that can come from that also undermines the whole industry self-policing, self-reporting model that we've been working under for generations.
Yeah, that's another good follow-up from Justin. You know, who would hire? That's why the funding is necessary, because, you know, this may be an oversimplification, but, you know, third parties can insert that. Third-party certified air monitors can insert themselves into these situations, but it just costs money. So yeah, it wouldn't necessarily be hiring. EPA would be evaluating whether they're capable of doing this monitoring, but it is not sort of a hiring type of situation. Andrew, do you want to take the drone question? Is that something that is within your?
I'm a little curious so there are some pieces of equipment that can be mounted on drones that can do some measurement, well, really more monitoring. I don't know if I've heard of many instruments that are drone mounted that do like actual measurement. So for instance, like the cameras that I use, there are new models of drones that potentially employ similar sort of optical technology where you can identify a plume of pollution. But that doesn't mean you're measuring it, actively sort of quantifying that plume. I'm not sure I've heard of drones that are, so yes and no. Like, yes, drones I think are kind of a new layer of monitoring that can occur for leak detection and repair. If there are drones out there that can do like actual quantification, I mean, that would require probably the drone to like fly directly through a plume. I haven't heard of that, but yes, the drones are starting to be employed, at least in terms of kind of the monitoring of emissions from facilities.
And there's the third-party air monitors cannot work for industry. That is written into the program.
As for drones, why don't you check out DARPA? They do a lot of that research.
Cool. Can you put that in the chat, David, just so we have that name? Thank you.
Another great acronym. Okay, we are a bit over time, so I'll let folks go if they need to go. We'll follow up with an email of the recording, and we'll include contact information for folks, so please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.